Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. My name is David Hart. I'm the director of ITIF's Center for Clean Energy Innovation, and I'm really pleased to welcome you here to our webinar called Buying Power: How Federal Procurement Can Drive Clean Energy Innovation. We have a really strong program, and I'm looking forward to the conversation that's going to ensue. Just a brief background on the organization. ITIF is a Washington-based think tank that focuses on a wide range of science and technology policy issues. And the Center for Clean Energy Innovation within it focuses on what we need to do to get to net zero and how the federal government can drive the change that's necessary. The occasion for this webinar is Dorothy Robyn's recent report, and she'll share the details with you a little bit later. But we have a fantastic keynote speaker to set the stage, and then we'll follow with a wonderful panel. So our keynote speaker is Andrew Mayock, and I'll introduce him in a moment. He will speak for around 15 minutes. We may have some Q&A time with him. Then Dorothy will present her report also for about 15 minutes. And then we have two panelists, Zev Briggs and Jim Connaughton, who I'll introduce at the bottom of the hour. And we'll spend the rest of the time discussing these issues with that group. So with that, let me introduce Andrew. He is the Federal Chief Sustainability Officer at the White House Council on Environmental Quality. And in that role, he leads the administration's effort to improve sustainability across the entire government. And of course, climate change and energy are a big part of that. He served in senior positions in the Office of Management and Budget within the White House in the Obama administration, and before that in the Treasury. And he also has substantial private sector experience. So we're really pleased to have him here. This is a really important set of issues and a key lever now, especially with the passage of recent legislation, to move the needle on clean energy and climate innovation. So Andrew, thanks for joining us. Be happy to hear some opening remarks, and then we'll have a little conversation.
Thank you, David. Thanks for the opportunity today. I want to thank ITIF for sponsoring this focus on what for me is a vocation. So diving in deep like Dorothy has and has in the past and continues to do through this report is extremely valuable directly to our work, as well as I think to the broader community. So very excited, very grateful to have the report in our hands, to have this dialogue today, continue to lean in on the work. In addition to the report, I just say, another quick word about the author. I've had the opportunity to know Dorothy going back to 1994 when I had the opportunity to be a White House intern while I was in law school at the National Economic Council. And then I've followed Dorothy's good and great work over the past few decades, and just an extraordinary contribution from DOD to GSA to NEC, and while being external to the government. So deeply grateful for that, Dorothy. And thanks again for this effort. I thought in teeing up this webinar, I'd provide a few direct reflections on the report and the work that's afoot currently in the Office of the Chief Sustainability Officer and government at writ large. Three themes came to mind as I was reading and digesting the report over the last couple of weeks and applying it directly to our work. And one is it's a new day in sustainability. And yes, there's significant challenges that are present, and challenges can be an understatement at some time. And there's significant structural changes afoot. Number two, the president's major policy achievements are having a profound effect on the sustainability agenda now, and certainly over the course of this next decade. And three, wanted to share that the innovation agenda is alive and well. I want to say a few points about each of those. One, on the structural front, I think the report does an excellent job of laying out the history of sustainability and energy efforts from the legal perspective, from the executive action perspective, and the challenges that they've faced in achieving results from the ambitious goals that have been set. I want to ground that in this new day that I find here, and I build upon it. And I have the context like Dorothy does from having worked in and around this space from the Clinton administration to the Obama administration, now to the Biden administration. And I find two profoundly different factors at work in the Biden administration here. Number one is President Biden's leadership, and climate being in the top three of what the president's trying to achieve, from campaign to now promise delivery here. As David knows, and Dorothy knows, and Zav knows, and others on this call, it's one thing to be in the White House and work on something that's high on the president's agenda, important to the president's agenda. It's another thing to work on one of the shortlisted things. The attention that it gets from the president himself, from secretaries, on down throughout the administration, makes it a profoundly different moment when it comes to go deliver on those things. So I wanted to point that out as we dive into this discussion. And two is, in addition to that leadership, this urgent moment that we find ourselves in, the clear and present danger of climate. We're either experiencing, if you're calling in from California, or watching this deadly heat wave on top of decade plus drought. We're experiencing with our fellow citizens and within federal operations, the damage that's being done by the floods in Kentucky, floods in Rhode Island the other night. So extreme heat to extreme flooding is currently very present in ways that wasn't showing up obviously during the Obama administration. It was being warned about right during the Clinton administration, and that effect is not surprisingly making it very real for all our colleagues here. And I think turning the focus that would otherwise be lost, as Dorothy notes in the report, as to mission and that direct access and connectivity to mission in this environment that we're experiencing as it gets warmer and these effects continue, is really becoming a profound motivator for the federal workforce, the federal policy agenda, and that accrues very well, in somewhat unfortunate context, of course, to the work that we're seeking to get done. Moving on to number two, and keeping these remarks short because I'd love to have the opportunity to take some Q&A. The president's major climate policy achievements. Don't need to say, but we'll say a couple words about just how profound the work, particularly over the last few weeks, but certainly the work over the last 18 months, and the legislative achievements from IRA to bipartisan infrastructure law to CHIPS to success that we've had in appropriations. We have direct and indirect effects from that funding and those policies that are feeding right into the sustainability agenda and the work that we're doing in really profound ways. So, speaking of the report and some of the recommendations of the reports, we were working hard on seeking to gain $7 billion through Build Back Better for the U.S. Postal Service to accelerate electrification and to encourage the U.S. Postal Service to move forward a year ago this time. And, we check in on that status today, and the U.S. Postal Service committed to 40% of its fleet being electrified before IRA was passed, and we're adding another $3 billion thanks to Congress and the president's leadership to that effort. We have another $1 billion plus headed to Dorothy's old agency, GSA, to invest in sustainability and emerging technologies. There's $2 billion in Buy Clean at GSA to invest and catalyze lower carbon materials markets. There's $2 billion in Department of Transportation for grants to incent and to catalyze those markets through that channel. There's funding, staying with the Buy Clean theme, there's funding at EPA to deliver the standards and the analysis that's necessary to go do that well and right, on the order of $350 million. So we've got serious legislative achievements that are having a profound effect, that are coming directly to the federal effort. Not to mention, the profound effects that the tax credits and policy that's driven through IRA on clean electricity and on vehicles in particular are going to have in the work that we do to take us to 100% carbon-free electricity in the federal government and fully electrify the fleet. And then the third thing I'd say back to the third theme on innovation being alive and well. We're doing a lot of work to get some really fundamental and transformative activities off the ground, like electrifying the fleet. And we're making some significant progress on that. For example, in 2021, the federal government in a light duty segment purchased about 1% of our purchases that year on zero emission vehicles. As we come into the end of 2022, we've moved that needle from 1% to 15% of our purchases, above the national average. And so our federal colleagues are leaning in very profound ways and changing systems in order to deliver on the transformation that we're seeking to deliver on. And that's, really solid blocking and tackling work that we're doing inside the federal procurement systems. And then we are also keeping an eye on and a focus on innovation, and a few projects I would cite there from the federal building performance standards, which would be the first federal standards, have been designed and are on the cusp of becoming public. And two, the Buy Clean efforts that I mentioned from the delivery of the policy achievements, legislative achievements. And three, we're hard at work on another thing that was cited in the report on minimizing climate risk through, in part, social cost of greenhouse gases. We're doing some very interesting work that we look forward to making public in due course on that front too. So I think that's a flavor of where we are. We're seeing a moment of structural change. We've got some serious wind at our backs through the legislative achievements, and we're working hard at the frontiers of innovation as well as we seek to execute the transformation that we're working on. With that, I'd be happy to take some questions, David.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. We have a few minutes for questions, and let me just encourage the audience to drop them into the Slido box. And if we can't get to them with Andrew, we'll get to them with the rest of the panel. Andrew, we lost your video, just so you're aware. There we are. So maybe you could just highlight a bright spot or two. Like if somebody says, concretely, I'm in Boston or I'm in Denver or wherever you might be, and I'm looking at what the federal facilities or the federal agencies are doing, like, what do you point to as your shining stars?
I think, I would take you back and go into a little more detail on the zero emission vehicle front, in that, as others know from their time in federal government, I know from my time at the end of the Obama administration, trying to make progress, significant part because of the market, but also because of the leadership signal and the push on an issue like zero emission vehicles was extremely difficult and incremental at best. Coming into this administration, which is recovering from a civil service perspective, we are certainly needing to build back better when it comes to the human capital infrastructure. Making quick progress on that was definitely not a sure thing. And in the first year of the president's term, in moving out on zero emission vehicles throughout the federal government, and with the Postal Service coming out with a 10% commitment, again, not aligned with the future that the president wanted to see. And to find ourselves here, as I was reporting on light duty vehicles, to go from 1% to 15%, a major lift. In the background and necessary for that accomplishment, of course, is implementing the charging infrastructure that's necessary for that. So we're at a place where we've got tens of thousands of chargers in the works across the federal footprint to go scale up the commitment that we've made, particularly when it comes to the light duty vehicles, by 2027 to have 100% of our acquisition be zero emission vehicles. So that in an environment, by the way, as everyone knows on this call, with an extremely difficult supply chain issue, with it being very hard to get a hold of zero emission vehicles, and two, while achieving success in IRA, having, as Dorothy points out in the report, having a challenging budget number when it came to zero emission vehicles, in the president's FY 2021 budget and what Congress enacted in the omnibus. So that I think is a really clear signal of victory, and from a quantitative perspective, and what sits underneath it from a data-driven, systems-based change management approach when it comes to that critical decarbonization initiative is even more profound. So we got a long way to go. We got a lot of work to do, but it's a real, I think, shining example of when leadership is given the signal and federal agencies are leaning in, they can deliver and over-deliver.
Thanks. Yeah, it's exciting. And I think your point about what lies under the surface is something that most people don't fully appreciate, particularly when we're thinking about grid-connected systems, which, of course, all these are. You didn't really lay out the agenda, but it is extraordinarily ambitious within the Executive Order 14057. So 100% net zero electricity by 2030 with 50% 24/7 carbon-free, 100% zero emission vehicles by 2035 with 100% of light duty acquisitions by 2027. So I don't know if you wrote these yourself. You wrote yourself a heck of a difficult job, challenging job. So we admire the ambition. So what would you say for someone who is looking for markers in the next, year or two? What should we be looking for to assess the administration's progress?
Yeah, thanks for delineating the federal sustainability plan's top goals. Would welcome the audience here to go to sustainability.gov to see it in its full form as a report and as an EO, and also get updates on it and see data to the point of like, where are we going to see progress? We've got a lot of data on that site that shows where we've come from, where we're headed. And the second thing I'd say about that, David, is group effort for sure. How did we get to the ambitious agenda? We basically had President Biden come in from a day one executive order and say, electrify the federal fleet and move us to carbon-free electricity as we seek to move the whole grid to a clean grid by 2035, and then go revitalize federal sustainability writ large. So we moved out on that general guidance and worked as a team throughout the federal family to go deliver on what is a very ambitious and daunting and achievable sustainability plan. And then I think from a next steps perspective, in addition to continued progress on the vehicle front as we push forward on that particular initiative, we've moved out with our agency colleagues on carbon-free electricity, for example, where we're working to fundamentally redesign the federal approach to electricity procurement. As you know, David, and others have been in the administration, it's not configured to go deliver on 100% carbon-free electricity as an enterprise. It is a highly federated approach when it comes to agencies and procurement, and we're working hard with a lot of great leadership in places like GSA and DOE and DOD to deliver an enterprise approach. You can see, so we're working on the plumbing and the infrastructure on that when it comes to human capital and business process. And then you can see some of that out there in the public with an RFI that was put out by DOD and GSA for carbon-free electricity in the winter, early spring, and they will be coming out with RFPs before the end of this calendar year to go further deliver on that. And then I think throughout the federal portfolio, as I noted, we're going to be delivering the federal building performance standards, making that policy public soon. That will be a big moment and put us on a pathway to electrification, energy efficiency in a very profound way. We are coming up on an announcement, which was already signaled in an EO, but the actual proposed rule for our major suppliers to disclose greenhouse gases, their climate risk, and set science-based targets. So we're very near to the announcement of that proposed rule through the FAR. And I could go on for a really long time because we got a really robust agenda. But those are some of the things out of what you listen to. And I would again encourage people to go to sustainability.gov or follow us at WHCSO on Twitter.
Thanks, Andrew, and thanks for making the time to join us today. I think everybody's going to be watching your office with great interest, and I think wishing you the best of luck in these very challenging tasks, and especially now that you have the resources to get after it. So, so good luck, and thanks again.
Thank you, David.
Yep. With that, let me bring on Dorothy Robyn. Andrew gave her actually a wonderful introduction, but I will reiterate some of what he said. Dorothy is a ITIF board member and a senior fellow with the organization, and it's been my privilege to get to know her a bit over the last few years. She is both a very serious thinker and a dedicated public servant, and that is quite an extraordinary combination. I'm really proud of the report that we released last month. I hope you'll download it and read it. It takes an incredibly complex subject and pulls out some crucial threads while providing a lot of evidence to back up the main points. So we're going to have her share some of her main findings, and then we will turn to the panel discussion. So Dorothy, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, David. So I started doing work on, at David's encouragement, on federal procurement and clean energy innovation. I guess even before, during the transition after President Biden had been elected but not taken office, and I looked at particular sectors. I started with the federal fleet, and then the postal fleet, and then federal buildings, and I was trying to identify ways that procurement could drive innovation, but I wanted to speak as someone who had been on the receiving end of federal sustainability requirements and found them very challenging to comply with. And so that was part of my message. And this particular report, which is sort of a meta look across sectors, really, it stemmed from an op-ed that I wrote in December after the sustainability executive order came out, but after Build Back Better was on life support. And the title of the op-ed was "It Takes Green to Go Green," and it was my message that you've got to give agencies the resources to meet these ambitious requirements. And in the long time it's taken me to do this, the administration has delivered. So it's a very different story. So this report is not critical of the Biden administration. This report looks historically at what happened pre-Biden in terms of federal sustainability, because federal sustainability goes back 50 years. It goes back to the 1970s oil crisis, when Richard Nixon directed federal agencies to reduce their energy consumption by, I think it was 7%. President Ford picked up that and ran with that initiative. And Congress then passed major legislation, part of which included requirements on the federal fleet, on federal buildings, on purchase of products. So we've been doing this for 50 years. And the dirty little secret is that prior to President Biden, it hasn't really been all that successful. I think, it's uncomfortable to say that. People don't want to talk about it, but that's the truth. So I'm gonna go through 4 slides fairly quickly that lay this out. The first is the federal fleet, and yes, what Andrew described is remarkable when you consider that for decades Congress and executive orders have been telling agencies to acquire alternative fuel vehicles and use alternative fuels and use less fuel. And this is the record that the federal fleet is almost entirely dominated by gasoline powered vehicles. Alternative fuels accounted in 2021 for just 1% of federal fuel use, down from a high of only 3.4% in 2013. And petroleum use was down just by a similar amount. The statutory goal was 20%. So this is a testament to the failure of our sustainability requirements on the federal fleet. Next, federal buildings. In 2007, Congress directed federal agencies to reduce their building energy consumption by 30% by 2015 from a 2003 baseline. They didn't come close. They got to 21% reduction. 7 years later, they still haven't hit the 2015 goal. This is a tale of two cities. GSA hits it out of the park. They exceed the requirements. Other civilian agencies don't make the mark, but they don't miss it by a mile. DOD, and I'm responsible for 3 of those years, DOD made minimal progress and brought down the average for the entire rest of the federal government because DOD is the 500-pound gorilla. They have 70% of the federal building space and 58% of all federal building energy use. Next, energy consuming products. This is a little known fact that we have done a terrible job of complying with multiple federal statutory and executive order requirements that federal agencies purchase energy efficient versions of energy consuming products. Think appliances, HVAC equipment, things like that. They account for a non-trivial share of energy consumption in federal buildings, and the federal government is the single largest customer in the United States for these energy consuming products. There were so many requirements that agencies do this that the Obama administration actually got that language into the FAR, the Federal Acquisition Regulation, which was a big deal to get that requirement to buy energy efficient products into the FAR. Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, which supports FEM, Federal Energy Management Program, has been analyzing the degree to which agencies are actually complying with this by looking at listings on FedBizOps, a website that every procurement above 25,000 has to go use. And the bottom line is that agencies are meeting the minimum legal compliance requirements only about half the time, and effective compliance, which is a more rigorous definition, less than that. So this is this is really problematic. And then finally, renewable energy. And this is where the federal government federal agencies did meet the requirement, which was to, by 2013 and thereafter, directly produce or procure 7.5% of their electricity in the form of renewable energy. Civilian agencies met the goal largely by buying renewable energy certificates. DOD deployed a large amount of utility scale solar energy on its military bases. So this, by this metric, things fell off during the Trump administration, but remained above the statutory requirement. Last year was 10%. This way of thinking about renewable energy is changing, as Andrew indicated, with the carbon-free electricity initiative and requirement. Now, so what I did in this report was to try to explain why agencies didn't do a better job of meeting these requirements. And in a nutshell, and again, I'm talking, this is pre-Biden, but sustainability, this was my message, sustainability requirements are or were an unfunded, that's changed, an unenforced mandate on budget-strapped agencies for whom clean energy is not the mission. The higher upfront cost of many clean energy technologies poses a particular challenge because of the nature of the federal budget and procurement process. So let me unpack that and look at each one. And the first obstacle to meeting these requirements, and I think these obstacles remain, the big one that's changed is funding. The first one is the limited alignment of sustainability requirements with agency missions. All of you who have worked with or in federal agencies know they go to extraordinary lengths to perform their missions. But for most federal agencies, and I spent 3 years at DOD, clean energy is not the mission. Recall the tale of two cities in terms of building energy consumption. GSA routinely exceeds federal sustainability requirements. Why? Because efficient management of federal buildings is their mission. DOD's poor track record on the same metric reflects the lack of perceived mission alignment. The military services chronically underinvest in their building infrastructure, which is what I oversaw, to pay for operational demands Many, if not most, large DoD buildings lack advanced meters to track their energy consumption. Now, DoD's contrastingly strong record on renewable energy is not an anomaly, but rather an example of mission alignment. Military bases depend on the commercial grid, which is vulnerable. On-site energy generation, together with microgrid and storage technology, enables a base to keep the lights on if and when the grid goes dark. LB&L's analysis of the compliance with the FAR requirement on energy-consuming products, if you look at it, it shows a low overall compliance rate, but remarkable variation between agencies and within individual agencies, even an agency like Navy or GSA. LB&L attributes it to institutional factors. I look at it and I say that's mission at work. The agencies with the high compliance rates are the ones for whom facility management or resource management more generally are part of their mission. Obstacle number 2, this is the one that has changed. It's closely related to mission, and that is inadequate funding and perverse federal budget rules. It takes, I said earlier, the nature of clean energy goods and services is that they often cost more upfront, even when they provide life cycle savings, which is often the case. Budget-strapped agencies typically don't have the green to go green. Now, this is a particular challenge for federal buildings, and many of the requirements target federal buildings because the federal government chronically underfunds its facilities. DOD, as I mentioned, takes money out of its infrastructure and puts it into operational exigencies. Congressional appropriators have diverted more than $10 billion over the last 11 years from GSA's federal building fund. Those are rent receipts from agencies. And the appropriators have used that money, that GSA money, to pay for non-GSA expenses. That's a chronic underinvestment that raises operation and maintenance costs and has resulted in a backlog of upwards of $200 billion in maintenance and repair projects. Federal budget rules contribute to the problem. The federal government lacks a capital budget, so major building renovations and new construction must be fully funded up front. Agencies can't take advantage of private financing, which is equivalent to telling them to buy a house without access to a mortgage. Budget rules similarly impede the procurement of renewable energy. OMB rules do allow agencies to use power purchase agreements, but they are effectively limited to a GSA authority that is limited to 10 years. And DOD, should note, has 30-year power purchase agreement authority. OMB and CBO, Congressional Budget Office, concerns about budgetary scoring are reportedly right now hampering GSA efforts to negotiate long-term contracts with utilities in order to meet the administration's 24/7 carbon-free electricity goal. Other budget rules encourage agencies to focus on the first cost as opposed to the life cycle cost of what they're buying. That's a problem for that has been a problem for vehicles. It's a problem for federal buildings. It's a problem more generally. Obstacle 3. These 3 obstacles are all related, which is why they're such a tough nut to crack. Obstacle 3 is the federal procurement process itself, which likewise has a bias in favor of first cost over life cycle cost. In many areas, contracts are awarded to the lowest price technically acceptable bid. And that clearly disadvantages clean energy technology, which recurring theme, it costs more upfront even when it provides life cycle savings. There is language in the FAR, but according to procurement expert Steve Schooner at George Washington University, that provision lacks teeth. It's not that prominent, and so what he calls the tyranny of low price is the dominant culture. Now, one more slide. Lawrence Berkeley analysts surveyed federal personnel involved in the procurement of energy consuming products. This was a small survey, only 100 people, but it's consistent with other studies of procurement personnel. Respondents, they asked them what their priorities were in terms of procurement. Respondents said that getting the lowest purchase cost was their highest priority, whereas buying energy efficient products was their next to lowest priority. And this is the amazing part. They actually, perversely, they ranked lowest life cycle costs as less important than lowest purchase costs. So that is an example of the tyranny of low price at work. There's a rich history of efforts to shift from first cost focus, low cost focus, to life cycle cost focus. A wonderful agency called, a program called ITIF that I talk about a fair amount in the report, that tried to make that shift, and everybody signed on at policy level, but it never happened in practice because there's enormous advantages from a low cost rule of procurement. It encourages price competition. It discourages favoritism on the part of the procurement officer, and it reduces the risk of a protest by a losing bidder, which can delay a procurement. So for all these reasons, the low cost approach has survived. Steve Schooner believes it'll take a dramatic cultural change to inject sustainability into the federal government's purchasing practices, including a fundamental shift to life cycle costing, which takes environmental externalities into account at every stage. As Andrew discussed, the Biden administration, one of many things they have now done, they are pursuing a major rulemaking. I didn't give them justice in the report. I only knew about part of what they were doing. It's actually quite broader than what I give them credit for. But I think this is going to be a long-term effort. Okay, so those are the obstacles. In conclusion, how am I doing on time? I argue that there is and Andrew's proving me wrong, but there's a fundamental mismatch between the policy tool, government purchasing, and the policy goal of advancing clean energy, because government processes such as budgeting and procurement are designed to minimize risk and lower upfront costs. And these processes serve really valid functions. I mean, they have their drawbacks, I'm quite critical of them, but they serve these incredibly valid functions. I hate the scoring rules in many ways, but they contribute to fiscal discipline. The first low-cost procurement rule contributes to it encourages price competition. So that's why these processes are so deeply ingrained. Sustainable procurement requires deviation from these processes because you need to spend more upfront and accept some risk that the promised payoff in lower life cycle costs will come about. Second, standard government procurement is even less well suited to stimulating innovation. Innovation is the riskiest and most costly phase of the technology development lifecycle, and to drive it, government needs to take on additional risk and cost, which typically it only does in the area of national security. You think about DOD's incredibly effective use of procurement, or a grave social problem. Think about HHS's use of advanced commitments to purchase hundreds of millions of doses of COVID vaccine before it even existed. Despite these challenges, I argue that innovation should be a priority for federal sustainability, and I wrote a separate, shorter paper on using innovation as the organizing principle for all the sustainability requirements on federal buildings, which would be ambitious. But I'm running late, so let me just mention a couple of recommendations. I make 16 specific recommendations, and the administration has made a number of these priorities. Let me mention three that may not be priorities for the administration. One is to take on OMB scoring rules. This is they impede the use of lowest life cycle cost contracts. And this was a recommendation that came out of the Department of Energy Task Force on Federal Energy Management that Jim Connaughton and I served on in 2016. This is not easy, but Andrew, as a former senior OMB official who understands scoring, is positioned to do it. Second, reform energy performance contracting. This is, I fear I'm running late, so this is an innovation issue. ESPCs, terrific tool. Federal agencies couldn't get by without it, but the ESCOs, the contractors, Honeywell, Johnson Controls, these wonderful companies that are developing this incredible technology, that's not what they're putting in federal buildings. The contracts are structured in such a way that as to make the ESCOs risk averse. So they are putting in old technology. They were late to bring LEDs to the table. So reforming that, and then finally leveraging DOD's huge market for dual use clean energy technologies, both on the military base side and on the operational side. I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, Dorothy. And let me just encourage our viewers and listeners to download the report and read it. There is a great deal of analysis and information that I'm sure you'll find valuable there. And Dorothy's just given us the high points. So I'm very pleased to have Zav Briggs with us to provide some remarks and thoughts, and we'll move into a discussion. And those of you who have questions, please post them on the Slido link. We're starting to get a good flow of those. So Zav is a former colleague of mine from the Kennedy School way back in the previous century, I believe. He's gone on to an illustrious career, including a stint as Principal Associate Director, or a PAD, at the Office of Management and Budget under President Obama. He's currently a Senior Fellow at the Brookings Metro and a Senior Advisor to Friedman Consulting. And he's going to kick us off with a few remarks, and then we'll move into a discussion. Again, please send us your questions. Zav.
David, thank you. It's great to be in conversation with all of you today. I think Dorothy's report is incredibly important. It's even more timely than we might have imagined just a couple of months ago. And I'm referring to the passage of a couple of landmark bills that invest in critical advanced industries, science and technology, climate action, CHIPS, and the Inflation Reduction Act this summer. So even more than if we were having this conversation, let's say in June. This is incredibly timely and important information, in my view. Let me share with you briefly a couple of takeaways that I have, a couple of things I hope we will take away from this report and act on. At a high level, and I think this should never be taken for granted, this report reminds us that government is a critical instrument, not just as an investor, some of those big bills that passed this year and also last year, but in addition, as a buyer, as the world's largest buyer of goods and services. And I think Dorothy is sort of saying to us, why would you act on climate change, a challenge so existential, so enormous, with one hand tied behind your back, in effect? We need to use the power of procurement in addition to the investment tool and the other tools. And for procurement, in order to do that, we need to go from nice to do, something that's fairly marginal and often, has failed in the past to meet goals, as Dorothy shows historically, to go from a nice to do to a must do and can do. And the way to do that is by shifting the institutional rules and incentives. You can't do it otherwise. Number two, I think the report includes a very insightful focus on all kinds of things the executive branch, the Biden administration can do, some of which it is, many of the things it is doing right now, as Dorothy stressed, and as we heard from Andrew. I'm particularly encouraged, I wanted to underscore, I'm particularly encouraged by the rulemaking process to rethink federal procurement overall. I think we have higher expectations of procurement generally in ways that, by the way, go beyond climate goals. And you cannot simply lob in new expectations or flexibility in sort of isolated parts of a larger rule that guides the entire government. You end up with a Frankenstein. So it's important to do that rule revision thoughtfully, and that is a potential game changer. It's one of several that Dorothy points to in the report. I'm encouraged to see exemplary agencies called out, what it is that they're doing well. It's really important to do that. They're showing the way, and it gives them credit, encourages them, and that feeds into further progress. I will add, as a former policy and budget person, as you said in your intro, David, there are a whole range of options here. And to use the last example that Dorothy gave around energy service contracts, for example, I saw these constraints again and again firsthand. I had these conversations with leaders in industry, the agencies that I worked with most a decade ago, roughly. And it's maddening, frankly, but there's more than one way to go here, and we shouldn't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. You could do an awful lot, for example, without shifting the underlying rules around budget scoring in any fundamental way. I'm not saying that's not a conversation worth having, but it can be a challenging one. Those are like changing accounting standards, that guide all of the budget estimation for every piece of legislation that's ever proposed, the president's budget requests, et cetera, and rulemaking proposals and more. So one need not shift that scoring in order to do other smart things that Dorothy calls for, like making energy service contracts work better, making sure that they help us buy the best, the leading technology, the boundary pushing technology, not older technologies. There's much more. Interest of time, I'll just say this very, very briefly. I think one of the subtexts in this report, rather than one of the main texts, is that talent and training matter in our government. I think that shows up again and again in different ways. Sometimes the report calls for investments in these things directly. Sometimes talent and training and effort, such as from the General Services Administration, are in a sense, they're on display in the report. It's important that we understand there's a backstory. Agencies have to invest in their people. Finally, though, I think that as much as I am all for executive action doing all that it can, Congress has a really important role to play. And that means that we all do, all of us who talk to policymakers and their staffs, and sometimes talk to them through the media or advocacy groups or other channels. At various points in time, Dorothy points to the incredible importance of budget flexibility and being sent healthy budget signals. The White House Office of Management and Budget is important to that. It would be a game changer if it would be said across the board, for this important class of goods, we want agencies to focus on life cycle costs. We want you to use structures like the Technology Modernization Fund, or we will make additional dollars available. Show us how you could put them to highest and best use to advance these purposes. That kind of thing in the budget process is a game changer. But let's not forget, presidents do not appropriate money. When the president's budget says the president provides, that really means proposes. And Congress has the power of the purse, and appropriators and their staffs get their say. They have a crucial role in the process. And I think that means that, a number of things, and I'll end with this, a number of recommendations that Dorothy makes are incredibly important, because appropriators tend to use a logic of justification, not just asking what's the right thing to do, but how do we justify this? How do we document why we chose to do this? What's the underlying analysis that shows us this makes sense? Kind of like an investment fund would when it makes a bet. What's the source of our conviction? What's the underlying analysis of the market, the management team, et cetera, that lead us to believe this investment will pay off? It's much the same for appropriators, acting at their best, and the role that Congress uniquely plays. So it's incumbent on all of us that want to further this change, not just to look to the administration, but also to bring Congress along, to encourage members of Congress that are doing the right thing and speaking out and showing leadership on these issues. I'll end there.
Thank you very much, Zav. Appreciate that reading of the report and looking at some of those subtexts. So we have a few minutes for conversation. Both of you worked within the government, and I'm just curious if you could just say a few words about the incentive structure that faces the person who's making a procurement decision. So there's an old saying, I know it's out of date in this century, but it was once said, you can't get fired for buying IBM. That was back when IBM was the only standard. So it implies a level of risk aversion. And that seems like a very challenging thing to overcome. But I wonder if you could just comment on, how powerful that incentive is, and how some of these changes might might change the way those incentives work at the level of the actual decision maker. So Dorothy, why don't you offer some remarks on that?
It varies. The incentives or the degree to which the budget rules or procurement rules impede what we'd like to see varies by sector. So let me take vehicles and let me describe what the problem has been. The problem has been, as I see it, the segregation of the first cost from the O&M costs. So a fleet manager, in the case of vehicles, I think you have an involved fleet manager. You don't have some anonymous procurement officer. You have a fleet manager who knows what, exactly what they want, but their incentive is to maximize value in that budget cycle. And that means going with vehicles that have a lower upfront cost. Do they have higher O&M costs? Yeah, but that's a separate budget category, and that's going to be a payment in future years, and it isn't going to affect the budget for acquisition of the vehicles. So they are not thinking in a life cycle way, and you see that in that's also true in federal buildings. Federal government doesn't build a lot of new buildings, but they get money for military construction. That does not address O&M. O&M is separate. This is why you have public-private partnerships, because you change that incentive structure. The former head of Army acquisition said to me in the discussion about this, he said, at DOD, we never made financial decisions. We made budget decisions. That referred to the annual nature. It's all annual. And I don't see how, it just seems to me that's a structural problem. The other big problem, and these are related, is the inability to take advantage of third-party financing, public-private partnerships for a lot of activities. This is a problem for me at DOD. It became a huge problem at GSA. And Dan Tangerlini and I really worked hard to try to change this in a number of ways, but we never could get beyond that. And then I think for energy consuming products, it comes down. It's not a budget issue. It's these anonymous procurement officers whose motivation is to get the lowest first cost, because that's the culture.
Sam, your thoughts on risks and cultural change?
Well, Dorothy's absolutely right, and it can help when there is whole of government leadership. It doesn't always take the form of the White House leading an interagency policy group or something like that, but those things can sure help provide cover, give permission, encourage creativity, but also ensure that the full range of considerations in procurement are on the table. Again, things are not looked at in isolation. That makes everyone, I think, feel more secure about where the conversation is going, and that's really important. At the same time, I would say when we talk about changing cultures, well, people do respond to concrete incentives and encouragement that they're given, and it can take a variety of forms, as we all know, inside of organizations, including big ones, whether it's for fleet managers, chief procurement officers, or others. But as some of our friends in this space, colleagues looking at other kinds of procurement, including by state and local agencies, corporations, and others are stressing, procurement is having a moment. This institutional instrument is coming under new scrutiny, but with a lot of imagination. And we're essentially trying to redefine success. And we're taking a space that has been extremely compliance driven and often risk averse, but on which there is a spectrum. There are those outlier high performers. And I love, again, that Dorothy calls them out in the report. So I think we have some working examples, David, I guess I'll say that, of what changing agency performance and the culture that leads to that performance can look like.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Let me just add to that. I think the fact that agencies have money now, that they got money from IRA and other places, that blunts reduces the impediment created by the scoring and the procurement rules. Giving agencies money, I mean, this is really game changing. Over the last week, I've been touching base with some of my sources in different agencies, and a year ago, 8 months ago, they were saying, this sustainability initiative is great, but we don't have the funds to carry it out. Now, it's a very different message. I mean, I heard this DOD, DHS. We have money now. We've been doing building audits for years. We didn't have the money to carry out the renovations. Now we do. EVs, we can have a conversation with the services now about EVs because there's money. We couldn't, they weren't interested in talking to us when we didn't have money. So I think this is a real game changer. Obviously, it can change. I mean, when Trump was elected, he revoked everything that wasn't statutory in terms of sustainability requirements, and money for anything called sustainability went away. But I think, so I think the money is a game changer.
David, can I add briefly on that?
Sure.
I couldn't agree more. And I would just say very concretely, it's important that signal come very proactively. It's especially important within the administration that it come from OMB to the agencies. And I will tell you from having had some of those conversations, not in this moment, but analogous ones years ago, sometimes you really have to pause, not just send over a number or something that sits in a memo, but say to officials in the agencies, no, we mean it. Our job is not simply to ask you to spend less on everything, but to spend smart, to spend well. And this is a part of that. So this money is meant for this specific purpose. Now put it to work. Show us how sometimes that takes the conversation and the follow through all the way through the budget process. But once we make it more of the new normal, I think it will really gain momentum and become institutionalized.
Thanks. We just have a couple of minutes left, and I know we're having a procurement moment, and we're upbeat after the Inflation Reduction Act. So usually I like to end the webinars on an upbeat note, but I'm going to bring us down here. So setting aside the prospect of a change in administration, what do you worry most about? Could you just give us just a couple of brief thoughts of signals that might alert us to pay closer attention again?
It's the lack of, one thing, the lack of continued availability of money. Somebody from DOD said, the problem the agencies are running into with EVs, Andrew didn't say this, but their GSA can't order enough of them. The OEMs are canceling orders. I think DHS actually went directly to some OEMs, but Navy asked for 600 EVs. GSA said we can get you 200. So there's a supply chain issue, maybe related to semiconductors, but this is affecting the EV initiative. And I think that what I worry about is that at the point where the vehicles become available, then there's no money. This is typically annual funding. So I worry about the lack of it. In many respects, it sounds like a lot of money, $4 billion to GSA. It's when you look at the pipeline of maintenance and repair projects for federal agencies, it's not really all that much. So I think it feels like a lot in the overall scheme of things. We need to keep it coming.
Zab, last word.
David, as Dorothy says, industry capacity for sure. My other concern is just that issues that have had some considerable ability to attract bipartisan and also nonpartisan support, they can always be politicized in all the wrong ways, in ways that really set us back, that slow down progress, that turn this into more, whether it's deficit hysteria or something else that prevents us from following through and building on all this positive momentum that we see. So that's a concern.
Thanks.
Can I say one last thing?
Sure.
I mentioned this to you in advance, and it's part of my message of leveraging mission alignment where it exists. And the biggest opportunity for this is DOD, both on the facility side and on the military operational side. And I want to just mention this. Heidi Shue, who's the Undersecretary for Research and Engineering in DOD, senior person in terms of technology. She put out her list of technology priorities for the military in February. And in addition to the usual suspects, directed energy and hypersonics and microelectronics, the list included renewable energy generation and storage. This is a technology to meet warfighter needs. DOD is not good at complying with sustainability requirements that don't align with mission. But when clean energy and DOD mission are aligned, there is no more powerful combination, and the sustainability initiative should be broad enough in scope to take advantage of that very powerful dynamic.
Well, thank you. Despite my best efforts, we're going to end on an upbeat note because I think that is an upbeat note. And again, congratulations on the report, Dorothy. I hope our viewers will take a look at it. Thank you, Zab, for joining us. And thank you all in the audience. In addition to Dorothy's most recent report, she has a fantastic report with Jeff Marquesi on DOD's specific role. So I encourage you all to take a look at those. Please get in touch if you have feedback or comments or suggestions. And with that, we close. Thank you.